Testing, testing, mic is working. So I guess I left Chicago thinking, great, I've finally got this random arbitrary barrier that I've been aiming to break for 3 years, sub 220. But I left knowing that there was more in the tank, and more in the tank coming for the next race that I already had planned, which was Indianapolis Marathon, exactly 4 weeks, actually incorrect, 3 weeks and 6 days later, because Indianapolis fell on a Saturday. So just shy of 4 weeks later. I already knew I was doing Indianapolis prior to even starting the Chicago Marathon block. And I guess the reason for entering Indianapolis was because I think backing up and doing 2 marathons in one season, I mean, it comes down to personal preference at the end of the day. We shouldn't necessarily judge people based on something that they want to do that might be against the norm or against the status quo or whatnot. But that's part of it for me. But the other part of it for me was trying to get a day that the conditions are great. Because what I'd noticed in the 19 marathons that I'd done before Chicago Marathon was that it was pretty rare that I would get to a race after training really hard for X amount of time where the conditions would be really good. It happened so rarely. And so because I started to fully understand how badly I was affected by warmer human conditions, I chose actually 3 races. Chicago, 4 weeks later, Indianapolis, 4 weeks later, CIM, to try and hit one of those at great conditions, assuming hopefully one of those will come out to be cold. Now, turns out, we're going to go through these next 2 parts and talk about everything to do with what happened between Chicago and post-race Indianapolis, but the weather in Indianapolis was pretty good. I would give it a 9 out of 10. And so in Chicago, I would give those conditions maybe a 5 or a 6 out of 10. Now, some people might be thinking, but a girl ran 2:09 there. That's true. For her, those conditions were obviously great. But for people that have a high sweat rate and for people that struggle in the heat, it was a little bit slower than running in perfect conditions. And I left Chicago thinking, I think if I'd gone out a little harder, I probably could have run, who knows, maybe 30 to 60 seconds faster. But I never actually tried to do that. I just tried to break 220 and get that in the bag. And I actually ran relatively conservatively through until maybe even half a mile to go, just making sure that I wouldn't be crippled by cramps in the final stages. And so I left Chicago really confident and really motivated to go after it at Indianapolis. And yeah, I mean, everything in between Chicago and Indianapolis went pretty well. I'm very lucky that over the last 5 months, I've had a very near perfect training scenario, which is really rare, very rare. I don't think I've ever had such perfect training other than over the last 5 months before. That's partly luck, but partly probably doing a lot of small things right, sleeping well, and I talk about those things in podcasts, gym and the diet and all those sorts of things. But yeah, across the board, I left Chicago thinking 2:16 is possible if I can get really good conditions. And upon reflection post-Indy, I actually think that, and we'll talk all about the specifics leading into Indy, and then we'll do a full race recap, Indianapolis Marathon, in part 2 of this. But I left Chicago thinking if it was 40 degrees that day and lower humidity, I think 2:16 to 2:17 would have been on the cards. I wrote that off when the forecast became clear that it was going to be 59, 58, whatever it was. It was much warmer than 50 and 87% humidity because, yeah, for me, that's just sort of 5 out of 10 weather. And weather is such a big deal when it comes to the marathon. It's a big deal when it comes to almost any endurance event outside. But for when it comes to the marathon, I mean, oftentimes you'll see people not hit their goals in the marathon and wonder why. And oftentimes it's just a case of it just being a bit too warm. It elevates your heart rate, elevates your, changes the way that your blood moves through your body. And just for me, my RPE, my rate of perceived exertion, gets really high when it's warm. I feel like I'm really working much harder than normal, and everything just feels hard, and that sends signals to your body to slow down. So yeah, that's sort of the reflection upon what I was thinking after Chicago Marathon when I ran 2:19:31.
Yeah, I would add, even like for myself, I found the conditions the first half of the race, which is like your race, to be uncomfortably warm. So I wouldn't even say it was just like you. I definitely felt it as well.
Yeah, I found it really hard to believe, honestly, when I crossed the line and heard that a lady ran 2:09. True story. I finished, I celebrated, did the video with Lanty that you saw in the last episode or the episode before. And then I walked up to a staff member and asked what the winning time in the men and the women were. And he said 2:02, whatever it was. And then he said the woman ran 2:09. And I actually thought he was wrong and went to someone else and went, oh, that mustn't be right. And then when the second person said 2:09, I was like, I want to reiterate, it wasn't bad weather, but at world records and times like that, such big leaps, I thought would require weather a little bit different to that. But, you know, the beauty of this marathon game is you very rarely come across concrete answers that applies to everybody and that there's no wrong or right. If you'd asked me if a woman would run 2:09 in 14 degrees Celsius and 87% humidity, I'd be like, no chance. But then it happened. And that's kind of the cool thing about the marathon, in that we're often proven wrong based on what we think.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, how would you say leading after Chicago, how many days did you take off and what was recovery looking like?
I said in a previous video that I don't ever really properly plan the recovery post-marathon because we don't know how we're going to execute upon that marathon. I'll never forget, Renato Canova, famous marathon coach, told a story about his athlete that won the Beijing Olympics, the male marathon. He took almost 4 weeks to fully recover and be able to run again because he buried himself so badly that day. It was very warm. He didn't fuel overly well in the second half. And you know, that paints the picture. You don't know how you're going to execute the race beforehand. Oftentimes it's out of your control. Oftentimes it's a fueling thing. You can miss gels, you can miss cups of Gatorade and whatever else is out in the course, which can change your fueling scenario, and the weather plays a big role. So I didn't plan the recovery, but I did take 1 day completely off and then about 3 days very, very slow jogging. I was just running, 40 to 60 minutes for a few days there. I think I did one run a little bit over that. But I did my first workout 6 days afterwards. I was in Kona at the time doing some content with Cam Worth, who ended up coming top 10 at Kona. And I did 6 by a K. And what was interesting about that workout was I was obviously not fully recovered at that point, and I was dealing with humid weather, very humid, 90% humidity and 75 Fahrenheit, 22, 23 Celsius. And I did the 8 by 1K at 3:15 to 3:16 per kilometer, which was basically the pace I ran the full marathon at. And that was at threshold. And I even wrote on my Strava, which caused a bit of a sort of healthy debate, about the fact that there's not that much point in training to a pace, because normally my threshold paces are a lot faster than my marathon pace. But on that day, I was still fatigued, training in humid weather. So the 8 by 1K was at marathon pace, but it was at threshold, which is in this case the same thing. And so, and when I say marathon pace, I mean what I just ran in the marathon or very close to it, within a second or two per kilometer. And so yeah, that was the first workout back. But the Tuesday after that, 9 days post Chicago, I did some hill sprints. I was actually on the phone to you in the warm up to that, Reem. And that was the day that I thought I felt like I was fully recovered from the marathon. But it's hard to tell when you keep training because you're always dealing with some fatigue. So it's hard to tell when you fully recovered from the marathon and when you're then just dealing with regular fatigue. But I think it was about 9 days before I felt good. And then after that, we had some really good workouts. I was lucky enough to join Anthony Farmer, the 221 guy that I showed you guys in the 4x5K video. He helped me in another workout of 10 by a K where we ran really well. We ran 2:54 average with a minute rest, which was a lot faster than I have done before. And yeah, it was sort of a couple more workouts in there, but I didn't push the needle too hard. There was only really twice that I did workouts at 90% effort or above, the 4x5K, which I put up last week, and then the 10 by 1K. Outside of that, there was a lot of easy running, a lot of easy volume. I even did another 100-mile week in there at one point, and that was mostly made up of sort of easy running and hill sprints a couple of times. But for the most part, it was being pretty careful about not training too hard between those marathons and just keeping on ticking over, touching on marathon goal pace, touching on threshold a little bit, touching on the hill sprints, which I think have been critical for me to improve this year. And yeah, the bridging the gap between the two worked out pretty well. And I think I arrived at the Indianapolis Marathon start line at 98% of what I was at in Chicago Marathon. And I think that's just because partly luck, partly experimentation, but I think I timed the peak for Chicago very, very well. And I do think it's a strange scenario to think about. I ran faster at Indianapolis by 50 seconds, but I think I was actually probably in slightly better shape on the start line of Chicago, but it was just the conditions that altered the two times. I actually think to this day, my Chicago Marathon result is probably a slightly better performance than my Indy result, even though it's slower by a minute.
Yeah. I mean, I was interested to see how you would gap between the two, Chicago and Indy. And I know you touched just now about a few workouts, but is there anything more that between the two that you kind of work through key workouts?
No, I just really tried to take it almost day by day by thinking ahead a couple of days, only really 3 days ahead at any point in time, because I tend to do hard workouts roughly every 3 days. But then I've never really fully categorized the hill sprints. That's not really a hard workout. It's more of a biomechanics power exercise. But yeah, there wasn't too many hard workouts. I mean, it's all on Strava, so you can see absolutely everything over there. But I think the 10 by 1K workout with Anthony, where we went 254, that gave me a lot of confidence in knowing that at Indy, I was really ready to give it a good go. Those 254s felt good. It was at 95% effort, or probably around there. And yeah, I kept everything else pretty much the same. I kept trying to sleep 8 hours a night, which you should do at all times, not only in a marathon block. I kept the diet just the same. You know, thanks to you, Reem, you really helped me with that. And I kept doing the same thing as I published in the middle of last marathon block with the diet. So I was doing the mini carb loads before every workout and sort of keeping relatively low calorie, low carb in between that. Low calorie, not really, but just a slight deficit, that is. My weight didn't really change in between the two. I lined up at Indianapolis actually slightly heavier than Chicago. I'm not super sure how that happened. I think maybe I got a little bit lax with the calorie sort of, I don't want to say calorie counting, but that is kind of what it is. I was about half a kilo heavier, but then again, that weight fluctuation can just happen based on water retention and stuff. But yeah, I lined up pretty much 69.9 kilos in Indy. I was 69.3 or 4, I think, the morning of Chicago. So yeah, very, very similar sort of approach, bridging the gap between the two than what I did before Chicago. And I guess I was just really fortunate that I didn't pick up any sort of major illnesses or any injuries along the way. But I do think I did everything I could possibly do to avoid those by keeping the gym in there, even between Chicago and Indy. I think it was 5 or 4 gym workouts in between the two, the same gym program that I was doing before. And yeah, 3 days out from Indianapolis, I was noticing the forecast was looking much better than Chicago, much cooler, a little bit breezy, but I mean, it was a bit breezy in Chicago anyway. And it all worked out well, yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that you felt a little heavier, which will maybe go into the question I have after this one, but you know, you celebrate a little bit after Chicago with the diet, so that will change for a few days, but like what was the diet after Chicago?
For about 2 days, I didn't care at all and just had pizza and whatever, didn't think about it. But then the rest of it was basically exactly what I posted several months back in the video about losing weight. I went back to doing a cycling of carbs where before every hard workout for 12 to 18 hours leading in, I did pretty high carbs. And outside of that, it was mostly meat, vegetables, and fruit at a relatively low calorie carb count. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to note that I'm not super fixated on the weight thing, because I think it can get a bit dangerous if you start to get really, really fixated on it. And even though I was slightly heavier on the day of Indy, I didn't let it worry me. I just thought, at this point, I'm just much, much lighter than I was last year. So the weather will be a bigger factor. But yeah, I didn't really change anything at all. I think it was probably just a case of maybe water retention as to why I was slightly heavier, but I don't really want to dive too much into analyzing weight and performance. But yeah, across the board, it was pretty much the same.
I also think maybe one thing you didn't touch on is the time that we're having lunch, breakfast, and dinner also plays a massive role.
Yeah.
It's something I researched a little bit a few years ago, but I think that's kind of what I also implemented when you're eating your meals is important.
For sure, absolutely, yeah.
And tell us about the magical carb load.
Yeah, so at the start of the next episode, I'm going to dive into the specifics about what I ate in this carb load. So in case you hadn't noticed, I'm doing a lot of experimentation this year, trying different things, trying different training approaches, trying different nutrition things. And I do them not knowing if they'll work out, or I'm willing to take big risks and fail, but I'm just keen to learn more and experiment with my own body, I guess. And I tried a carb load in Chicago that worked, and I sort of took it to a new level in Indianapolis. And what I did was, there's a Swedish person that's made up the name of this particular load, and I can't remember his name right now, but you basically do a certain amount of time, roughly 3 to 5 days. I did 4 days. This is leading into Indianapolis, where you go quite low carb, quite low calorie, and almost try and deplete most of your carb stores. And then for 2 days, you do a huge carb load, where you switch gears and have, a huge amounts of carbohydrates for basically 48 hours leading into the race, with the hope that the depletion of the carb stores makes your body maybe search for fat and fuel to use for energy. And when you give it a huge rush of carbs, then your glycogen stores are full. I mean, there's probably slightly a placebo effect to this, but yeah, I really pushed the limits. I had 880 something grams of carbs on the Thursday, so race being Saturday morning. And then on the Friday, I had almost 1,000 grams of carbs, I think 970 something. And in the start of this next video, I'll actually get out the log and be really specific about what I had and show you absolutely everything. There was a time on Friday night, about 12 hours before the race, where I wondered if I'd overdone it, if you know what I mean. But turns out, I don't think I did overdo it. I turned up to the line feeling pretty good. I mean, on Friday night, 9 p.m. before going to bed, I felt very bloated and very just big and heavy, and my mind was just frazzled too. Like I felt like I had ADHD times 10, even though I kind of always have mild ADHD, but undiagnosed. But yeah, I felt very scattered. Anyone that's done a big carb load would know that feeling. And yeah, it worked. I mean, I felt really good in the race. We'll talk about that next episode in more detail. But the strategy works, but I do think you have to be careful. You have to remember that I have a strong gut in the sense of I don't have any GI issues typically. It's very rare that I do. If you do have GI issues regularly, you're going to have to probably take this approach a little bit more conservatively than I did. But yeah, in the 4 days, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday before Indy, I reckon I was having 2,000 calories a day with about 100 grams of carbs. And for reference, if you eat relatively mindlessly, most people will fall between 25 and 3,000, 2,500 calories and 3,000 calories a day, and probably about 200 to 300 grams of carbs, maybe more. So I was quite a bit under that. And then I switched to 880 and then 975 grams of carbs, which is, I mean, even without fats and proteins, that's over 4,000 calories a day, or around 4,000 calories a day. So it would have been probably almost 5,000 calories a day for the 2 days leading in, or 4.5, something like that. So yeah, worked for me. I would recommend trying it out, but just be a little bit careful with that because the GI distress can occur, but it all worked out perfectly for me, so yeah.
And I guess considering everything is the taper.
Tapering, I think, is, firstly, I think some people have gone a bit overboard with how long a taper should be. I'm hearing people, and even some people that I coach, are suggesting that 3 weeks of tapering is, a good idea. I think that's simply too much. I think sometime between 10 and 14 days is pretty good. I tend to drop my volume down then, but I keep training at a relative intensity, but I just make the workouts a bit shorter. So volume drops by about 20% in the second last week, and then about another 20% in the last week. But I honestly think people become a little bit too strict with this, and they don't need to be really, really specific about the percentage drops. I think what's most important is listening to your body again. It's like a lost fine art, and I'm really doing that really carefully. Yeah, I mean, speaking of tapering, by the way, and one thing that I want to mention in this video that I'll mention in the next video as well, is next year we're actually planning on doing a lot more training experiences. So we've done 6 training camps so this is just a side note. We've done 6 training camps at Sweat Elite, and we're doing many more next year. But they're not actually going to be under the Sweat Elite name. They're going to be under a new brand called Eat, Run, Travel, name inspired by something I'll explain later. So Eat, Run, Travel. The reason for changing the brand name of the camps is that a lot of people that were interested in coming on our camps were turned off by the name Elite, and they were thinking that they weren't good enough to join the camps, thinking that everyone coming would be elite athletes or sub-elite athletes when they weren't. I mean, we have beginners come to our experiences after they understand that it's for everyone. But we're actually having a camp in Arizona, in Phoenix area, in Scottsdale on January the 31st for 4 days. It'll be a lot of fun. I'm making a shorter camp because I've noticed in America people have less annual leave, so we're making a long weekend, Friday to Monday. January 31 till February 3, it'll include lots of running education. I'll do seminars based on everything that I've learned about marathon and half marathon, 10K, 5K. We're going to be going to Sedona for the day and doing a lot of social activities as well. And it's absolutely all inclusive. So it includes all meals, airport transfers, accommodation in a house, and all the events as well. So if you'd like to learn more about that, that's in the link in the description of this video. You can also find the link in the top corner right now. I'll put it up. But I thought I'd just give that a bit of a plug because we're working on that right now. We're releasing it to the public today. It's only available for 12 people, but next year there'll be many more of those. So stay tuned about that. But yeah, I'll talk much more about tapering, obviously, on that camp as well. But yeah, I feel like I've got the taper down pat for me, and I've been able to sort of fine tune that over the last 2 builds, Indy and Chicago. And I almost take things day by day a little bit in the taper. I don't plan too much. Sometimes if I just feel a little bit too tired, 5-6 days out, I'll reduce a workout a little bit. But so much of what I'm doing right now, which is working for me, is sort of on intuition. And it's on like gut feel, and it's something that I guess you can only really do that well after being in the game a long time. And so I guess that's where it's useful being a coach to sort of really try and teach these things to people that are interested in learning more about. But tapering's a little bit of an individual thing, but I've learned for me that reducing the mileage by roughly 20% 2 weeks out, roughly another 20% 1 week out, keeping the intensity there, but reducing the workouts by originally about 20% and then about another 20% in the last week. That's seemed to work for me. So I tend to do my last hard workout about 5 or 6 days out, and I do another little tune-up about 3 days out, 4 days out. I mean, in this particular case, I did 5 by a K at marathon pace, 3 days out, and that worked. And that was just based on intuition and gut feel. And yeah, it worked out well. Approached the start line, feeling good and ready to go.
That's incredible. I do have one question, and I think a lot of our Sweat Elite Coaching Academy members, just shout out to all of them. They're all been so supportive for you and for us. I'm sure they're all maybe curious, I know I am a little bit, to see with everything you've done this past build and this past summer, is there anything that you would maybe take and implement into our members and to your coaching?
Sprints, speed work. I think I'm going to start implementing that into most people, but it depends a little bit on the person and their background and where they are in their journey. I think the sprinting that I've done this year every week, basically, the hill sprints, the more I'm looking into this, the more I'm understanding it's a biomechanics and muscle recruitment thing. And I think that if you hammer the long endurance stuff too much, which is what I did for the last 5 years, you can really lose your ability to run fast. And there's something magical in being able to sprint. It almost gives you the ability to run more efficiently at slower speeds if you've done that endurance stuff. So it's really critical as a coach to understand the person's position and where they are in their lifetime journey with running. But I think most people that have been around for 3 or 4 years that have done quite a lot of long runs, a lot of LT1, LT2 threshold work, a lot of VO2 max work, I feel like most people would benefit quite a lot by incorporating really specific speed. And when I mean speed, I don't mean 5K, 10K pace stuff. I mean like sprinting, like very close to 400 meter pace. Maybe not every single week. Maybe it could be every 2 weeks or every fortnight, as we like to say in Australia. I've said that word a few times in the US and people are like, what is a fortnight? 2 weeks. So I'm going to be starting to introduce that a little bit more to people that I coach, because I mean, some people come to mind already that I think would benefit a lot from that.
Yeah. I know you've included it in my training this past
Yeah, you've included it most weeks, and you dropped from 326 to 319 in several months, and you even had to stop multiple times, with GI distress. So yeah, it's worked for you as well.
Yeah, and it's actually really quite challenging to be able to sprint. You think you're going fast, and it's it's incredibly difficult. So that's really cool to hear. That you're going to be like stepping the game up for our members here. And Matt is available for some additional coaching if anyone's interested.
Yeah, just opened up a couple more spots. I'm going to be doing a little bit less travel over the next year with I'm growing up, family potentially on the way, dog and all these things. So yeah, I'll explain more about Sweat Elite's future in another episode, but I am taking on a few more athletes now with more time up my sleeve with less travel. So
yeah, check us out at Sweat Elite Coaching Academy for Clara as well.
Yeah. All right, I got to get my notes up from the carb load so we can record the part 2, because I need to have it to explain to you guys. So we'll be back in the next episode.